What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I really want to explore this idea of Shang-Chi, the Ten Rings, and Kang the Conqueror having a connection to each other. And a lot of you guys were asking in the previous video that I made why it is that I'm so obsessed about this idea of like Kang and the rings and how it all ties into Shang-Chi. Here's a reason for that. Based on the post-credit scene, we know that like Shang-Chi will be part of the new Avengers, right? We know the new Avengers are coming, but here's the thing. Based on what we know what's happening and what we've seen happen in the MCU, whenever we as the audience think of an Avengers film, any kind of an Avengers film, we think of like the big show, right? If the Marvel Cinematic Universe was wrestling, Avengers movies are WrestleMania, right? Like the big thing. And so whenever I think of something like New Avengers or something leading up to it, I think of like a big series of events that culminates in this huge calamity, right? This huge sequence of things that are happening. And we know Kang the Conqueror is like the big guy. With Spider-Man and Doctor Strange 2, it's very easy to kind of look at that and get lost in this idea that like there's the multiverse and there's different things going on, other Spider-Man and so on and so forth. But that is, by all standards of measurement, small time stuff. It's an interim event to the bigger things that are taking place. The reality is the great big huge next event, right? The next major villain that we're aware of that is going to have a kind of sequence of events that center around them that are somewhat equivalent to what we saw with Thanos and like the Infinity Gauntlet and all that stuff. It's Kang the Conqueror. So I think everything is all leading into that. And so what we're getting here, I think with like the 10 Rings and like the Eternals and Doctor Strange 2, the Multiverse of Madness and like Spider-Man 3 and so on and so forth, that is all kind of like the equivalent of seeing like Captain America's shield and Iron Man and stuff like that, right? Thor's hammer landing in New Mexico in a post-credit scene. It's on a much larger scale, but it's basically these small little things that appear over the course of movies that lead into like a big event, which is the Kang the Conqueror appearance and all the different heroes fighting him. So because of that, I think that what's going on here with like Shang-Chi is it's gonna give us like the whole new Avengers thing, but I think it's also going to lead into what is in effect Avengers Forever. Now, before I get into that, because that'll basically see the return of like most likely Tony Stark, Chris Evans, Captain America, things along those lines, let's kind of step back a little bit and ask, how do we get from like A to B, right? How do we link these things together? Now, going back to our discussion on the post-credit scene for Shang-Chi, I still stick by the idea that the rings were created by Kang the Conqueror. Now, there are a lot of theories out there saying the rings were created by the Eternals, and there's evidence for that, right? That we know that like Wong and them, Doctor Strange, and as part of the whole Sorcerer Supreme landscape, they don't have any knowledge of these rings or not in the tombs, but if these rings were developed either by the Eternals or by the Celestials for the Eternals, and the Eternals had basically walked away from being involved in the affairs of humanity in terms of guiding them, they stood hands off and just kind of intermingled with society, but essentially erased all indication of their existence, then it would make sense the rings would be erased as well, right? They would just put them somewhere, hide them away, and that would be it, right? Then they would just kind of go about and do their own thing. And so if the rings have been hidden away all this time, nobody would know that they exist. If you look at Carol Danvers and she says there's no knowledge of these rings across the universe, that lends credence to the Eternals theory as well, because if the rings were created by the Celestials for the Eternals or created by the Eternals themselves, they wouldn't exist anywhere in the universe. They would only exist on Earth. And in terms of Bruce Banner saying, I don't really understand anything about these rings, they would make sense, right? The technology that's possessed by these Celestials, because I still stand by the idea that the Eternals are basically just gonna be super advanced robots, but the kind of technology the Celestials would possess just by virtue of being space gods would be far and away beyond anything humanity could possibly comprehend. So it would make sense that somebody like Bruce Banner wouldn't fully understand it. I don't even think Iron Man would. If anybody were able to really understand what's going on with these rings, it would likely be Reed Richards, right? He'd be the guy that'd be able to figure it out. The intelligence of Reed Richards is known throughout the universe, right? Like everyone knows how smart Reed Richards is, and probably the most respected mind among everybody, every race across the entirety of the Marvel Universe. Even cosmic entities like Galactus realize how intelligent Reed is, right? So he'd probably be the guy to be able to figure it out. But a lot of that stuff lends credence to the idea that like it might be eternal technology. Having said that, I don't really think it is. It seems kind of small beans to introduce something like the 10 Rings that could lead up to something big and then say it was developed by the Eternals, and it's just a throwaway thing that happens. We just like learn about it in the Eternals film, and it opens up and like the 10 Rings are there, they throw them in a cave, they leave, and that's basically it. It would seem a little disappointing and kind of a waste, but it would also be pretty simple, right? So that's possible. Having said that, I stick by the idea that the rings were created by Kang the Conqueror. Now, the question is, how did they end up in the modern era? Well, I think the answer to that question lies in the purpose the rings serve. So one of the big things that we kind of have to wrap our head around here when it comes to the MCU is that up to this point, we've dealt with what is in effect linear time, right? 5 o'clock, leads to 6 o'clock, leads to 7 o'clock, leads to 8 o'clock. Done, right? Time moves in a forward direction. What we're talking about here when it comes to somebody like Kang the Conqueror is the equivalent of you throwing a baseball across a yard, but instead of it going like forward across the yard, instead like that whole yard represents time. So like throwing that baseball for Kang the Conqueror, he could throw it and the other side of the yard is 5,000 years ago, right? That's how Kang the Conqueror works when it comes to time travel. And so if these rings were created by Kang the Conqueror and they're emitting some kind of a beacon, which Wong said they were, presumably across the entirety of the multiverse, it kind of makes sense, right? That's what Wong said, like it's emitting a beacon into the multiverse. It's more circumstantial that tells us that because what we saw with like the whole depiction was like the kind of multiversal web that was shown at the end of Loki and so on, is that it looks like it's sending a beacon into the multiverse. Then if it was created by Kang, the most logical conclusion to draw here is that Marvel's basically going with the map maker concept, right? So in Marvel Comics, when the multiverse was collapsing, what the map makers were doing was something called writing incursions, right? If you guys remember our discussions on that, the whole idea behind this was that you had an incursion taking place, meaning that an Earth would just pop up and it was basically universes crashing into each other. You would have an 8-hour window between the time that you first see that alternate Earth until they make contact, right? If both Earths touch, both universes are destroyed. If one Earth is destroyed, the universes pass through each other. What the Sidera Madris were doing as part of the agents of the map makers is the Sidera Madris were like reconnaissance guys, right? They were field agents. They were going out and getting information and then reporting back to the map makers. And so the way this would work out is that when an incursion happened, in some of these instances, the Sidera Madris would be on an Earth. And so when the incursion took place, one of those Earths would be a dead husk. And what the Sidera Madris would do is they would quite literally jump from that alternate Earth onto the new alternate Earth. And then they would basically dislodge a chunk of that destroyed Earth and send it crashing into the new Earth. And that would basically give the map makers a place to travel to, right? It was basically sending out like a giant flare and saying, this is where we are. And then the map makers would follow that. They would arrive on that new Earth, they would wipe out all life, and the process would begin again. But the reason they did that is that by jumping from Earth to Earth, they were mapping the multiverse. That's all they were really doing, right? It was literally just leaving a trail of breadcrumbs so they'd always known where they had been, and they could trace everything that was going on. It makes sense that's what would be happening with Kang the Conqueror. With Kang the Conqueror having returned at the end of Loki, one of the things to contend with here is the multiverse is a big place, and if you're the only Kang that's left, the only one there, the multiverse does not necessarily or may not necessarily have come back exactly the way that it was before the War of the Kangs. And so you kind of have to start over again. You got to map the whole thing, if for no other reason than to verify what you already know. But mapping the multiverse is a difficult task. So what better way to do that than to create artifacts, items that you basically send out into the multiverse and they just arrive on these different Earths. But if Kang sends them into the multiverse and they arrive on those Earths, they just arrive whenever they arrive, right? I mean, it's just kind of like, we're just gonna send it there. And maybe it arrives at 4,000 BC. Maybe it arrives in 5,000 years. Whatever the time period happens to be on that Earth when those rings show up, they simply just arrive there. Now, the Mandarin likely stumbled across them, realized he could use them in his primitive understanding of the rings, like we pointed out before, and he just used them to kind of conquer territories and make himself powerful, and they granted him some level of immortality, and that was basically it. But the whole time, the rings are sending out a beacon, right? As soon as the Mandarin got his hands on them and basically activated them, turned them on, they started sending out a beacon. And they were basically telling Kang the Conqueror, here is a world that has not been conquered, or here's a universe that has not been destroyed, or here's what the universe looks like, whatever the case happens to be, right? Scanning the whole thing and just sending that information back to Kang so he always knows what's going on in that particular universe. So if he decides to conquer it, he at least has some idea of what to expect. That, I think, is the role the rings would serve as they relate to Kang. Now, having said that, that is a little complicated, but I think it also makes sense, and it's something they could build up with over the course of the MCU by the time we get to Kang. But if what we're looking to do is tie into Kang, then this works, because then you start going into the idea of Avengers Forever. And that's where you really get the whole role that Kang, I think, plays in the MCU. That again, whenever we think of Avengers movies, we think of like the big show, right? Like the big pop-off event, like this is where it's all been leading to, live on pay-per-view. That's usually what we think of when we think of like Avengers movies. And so what better way to bring in Kang as like the big bad and say, this is a guy that exists out there in the multiverse, and this guy goes part and parcel with time, and then basically have him face off against a whole bunch of Avengers teams from different points in time. That was Avengers Forever in Marvel Comics, right? Avengers Forever was a coming together of Avengers teams from the past, the present, and the future. And so what you get is like the original Avengers roster, assuming that Disney can make good with Scarlett Johansson, which at this point, I have no idea whether that'll work or not. So like basically the Avengers roster from the first Avengers film, who in turn team up with the new Avengers, who team up with whatever the future Avengers end up looking like, which would be cool because it would basically be Marvel telling us this is what we're leading to, right? Like this is what the next iteration or the future of the Avengers are going to look like. Keep your eye out, right? I mean, it'd be cool to see that. And then like all three generations team up, they face off against Kang the Conqueror, and they win, right? Days saved, roll credits. I could definitely see that happening with like Kang as the main villain for the MCU. But again, it really all depends. It just kind of depends on what they're shooting for. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. If you guys think this is a ridiculous concept, if you think it's absolutely nonsensical, if you think it's entirely possible, let me know. But thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.